question, Turkish. I didn't understand anything, but I think you gave a nice introduction. And I want to thank the organization for the opportunity for me to have a presentation here in beautiful Antalya. And nice that you come to this meeting. I come a little bit towards you because I think the distance between the stage and the people here is a little bit much. So I would like to have, if you have any questions, please interrupt me. Or whether you want to discuss certain topics, don't hesitate to interrupt me. And I'll be glad to talk during my presentation then. Are there people here who are involved in the addiction care as a treater, or as a, does anybody work in addiction treatment? Okay, and perhaps also in youth addiction treatment? Okay, nice to see. It's my specialty. It's also let's say the core of my chair as a professor in Leiden University, and I'm part of a research institute in the largest mental health institute in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is only a small country with about 17 to 18 million people. I will talk today about the Youth in Transition study. And this study, we received a grant a couple of years ago, in 2018 it was. It's an ongoing study. I can present some of the results, but not yet everything. And it's a prospective cohort study, so a longitudinal study, and I will talk about it. So a little bit about the main objective and the design of the study, and the background and the rationale. As I said, it's a study into the long-term cause of addiction, comorbid mental health disorders and social functioning, and I call it in the critical transition from adolescence to early adulthood. And I think that is a critical transition. We base the study on two interrelated studies. We make use of existing data from a Dutch survey that has been done a couple of years ago and is still ongoing in adolescents in the general population. So partly that's part of the study. And the core of my presentation here, I will talk a little bit about the general population adolescent study. But the core of my presentation is about high-risk youth who apply for treatment for an addiction problem in our country. And that's what the study is about. So first, a little bit general population data. They are derived from TRAILS, is the acronym, and TRAILS means Tracking Adolescents Individual Life Survey. And it's not a birth cohort, it is a cohort of 11-year-olds, and they are followed through life every 3 to 4 years. And I think they're now in the 8th or the 9th wave even of that longitudinal study. These are data that were conducted when the sample was at the age of 19, and they looked with the DSM-4 into the diagnosis. With a structured interview, must know the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, the CD, well known. And this is what they found. Quite some high rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and behavioral disorders, so including conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, and ADHD, but also, and perhaps particularly, high rates on a lifetime basis of substance abuse and substance dependence. Now, it's quite easy to meet the criteria of abuse in DSM-4. So generally, dependence is a better indicator of, let's say, serious addiction, where you really face also the consequences of the substance use. But still, it's quite important to see that in our country, and it's about the same we saw in the United States, that about 1 in every 14 adolescents, at the end of adolescence, has met the criteria of dependence on a lifetime basis. Well, lifetime in adolescence means maybe a couple of years. It's a short period. It's not like 20 or 30 years. So I think that's still quite high for a population survey. What these data also indicate is that there is much overlap between, let's say, all disorders and the disorder groups. So nearly 50% met any lifetime disorder on or before the age of 19. And if a lifetime disorder was diagnosed, in nearly 3/4 of the cases, it was a comorbid disorder. So single diagnoses are very rare in this group. And I think that is internationally recognized. When you look at the emergence, so at the age of onset of disorders, including substance use disorders, you see a clear order. ADHD is one of the first disorders that emerges at young age, which makes sense for ADHD because even it is one of the criteria, I think in the DSM-4, that a few of the symptoms had to be met before the age of 12, I think, or 7. So ADHD followed by anxiety disorders, at early age often separation anxiety. You're, as child and adolescent psychiatrist, you are familiar with that. Followed by conduct disorder and ODD. A little bit later in the age, the mood disorders. So let's say starting at around 10, 11, 12 years on the rise. They're, let's say, harmonized to 100%, but they of course have different prevalences. And at the end, clearly as a last disorder, dependence is the last in the row. And what you can see, these are the 7% dependence in the cohort. And if you look at the 50%, you can see that even at the age of about 16 or earlier, half of those with dependence already met the criteria of dependence before the age of 16. So that surprised me much. Clearly, there is a strong interrelationship between addiction and between, I call it non-SUD, so non-substance use disorder, other mental health disorders. Kessler, well-known American researcher, noticed that, and that you can see from the picture before also, that most mental disorders precede the addiction and are not followed. That's really the sequence. The risk of dependence in adolescence is quite strongly influenced by the earlier presence of non-SUD mental disorder. Especially behavioral disorders and especially ADHD in combination with conduct disorder is a high risk for developing substance dependence. This is a sort of relative risk measure, hazard ratio. So it increases the odds on dependence with a factor 5 even. And even mood disorders, they have a sort of factor 3 improved risk or enhanced risk on dependence. When you look at the risk factors for substance use disorders, the first thing that you notice is that they do not really differ between those for other mental disorders, so like depression or anxiety or even psychotic disorders. Most of these risks are in the broad social and the institutional environment, but also in the more close family and peer environment. Think with peers with deviant attitude, delinquency, positive outcome expectancies about substances, etc. But of course also on the personal level. Yesterday I had a presentation and I sort of filtered out the important role of self-regulation throughout life, but especially starting in early childhood and in adolescence. Now, these are sort of the usual suspects. So we know that these, and there are many other examples to give, these together give a quite high risk on a whole array of problems in life. But still, what we know is that it's not like one or two or only a few factors that are decisive for having negative outcomes later in adulthood. It looks more that, let's say, the cumulative risk, so the multitude, the accumulation of risks, is a decisive factor for negative outcomes in life. But still, it's quite difficult to predict based on these risk factors, which adolescents will and will not develop persistent mental health or addiction disorders in later life. But still, and this study is a nice example of that, still our accuracy of prediction gets better and better. It's get more accurate. This is a study of Madeleine Meyer, and the study that was done is called the Dunedin study. It's a quite famous study, famous because it was done in New Zealand, and it was a birth cohort where and this cohort was followed up to 40 years in life. And the special part about this study is that they nearly had no dropout. So even after 40 years, they had, of those who lived, still like 90 and 95% of the people they could reach. So the special thing is that you basically have a non-biased sample, which is quite rare in our field. So you can make robust conclusions based on sequences of things that happen in life. It's a cohort of 1,037 young people. They looked at dependence, and dependence was defined as any dependence on alcohol, tobacco, cannabis or hard drugs pooled. And persistence of substance use disorder was defined as that at the 4 ages in adulthood, you had to have persistence at least 3 of the 4 assessments in adulthood. What they found was when you include tobacco, that 19% of the sample had persistent SUD throughout up to the 38th year in life, from adolescence. And when you exclude tobacco, it was still 9%. I think that's in the Netherlands not far less. So these are, again, general population data, in this case from the Dunedin study. To predict persistence, they looked at, well, also here, quite well-known factors that predict bad things in life. Low social economic status, still something that is not widely enough acknowledged, I think. Poverty is a very strong predictor of earlier death and worse life circumstances. A family history of substance dependence, childhood conduct disorder and depression, as I said before. Let's say certain parameters, exposure to substances or to frequent substance use in adolescence. And the last one is being a boy. Boys are much higher at risk for substance use disorders than girls. And this combination, what they simply did with these 9 risk factors is they counted them as each as having the same weight. So each risk factor could be a 1, yes, it's present, or a 0, it's absent. So you have a cumulative risk index that can range from 0 to 9, and based on that risk index, they were able to reach an area under the curve of 0.80. And that means that from any random sample, they have a 80% right chance to predict which of the 2 adolescents will not or will develop persistence. And that is in statistical terms in our field is quite high. So we are reasonably good in persisting who will and will not develop persistence in addiction in life. Back to the design of the Youth in Transition study. It's a naturalistic study, so we do not do anything with the treatment. It's treatment as usual. We do not modelize it or model it in any way. It's a multi-center, prospective cohort study, and we were able to reach 10 of the 13 regular addiction treatment organizations in our country. Again, the Netherlands is a small country, but most of the organizations we were able to meet. We pre-stratified our sample from the bigger population based on the treatment organization where they were included, to ensure, or at least to promote, nationally representative sample. Our goal was to reach 420 youngsters, high-risk youngsters in treatment, and at the end we had, well, more than 30, I think even more than 40 sites where we recruited youngsters in our sample. It's a quite straightforward longitudinal study met around treatment entry, a first baseline assessment, At the end of treatment, an assessment with the treatment physician, basically, or psychiatrist, and then 2 and 4 years after baseline, the 2 follow-up measures. And we hope to get extra funds to even conduct an 8 years follow-up. These are the major research questions. How many youth have persistent SUD after 2 and 4 years following addiction treatment entry? We do not know much at all about that, not from the worldwide literature. There are like studies, maybe that I can count them on one hand, that have a sufficiently robust sample of those in addiction treatment, young people, and have a long enough follow-up period. It's like 1 or 2 or 3 studies. And in Europe, we don't have any, and in the Netherlands, of course, also not. The second question is, what is the longitudinal course, not only of addiction, but also of comorbid mental health disorders, social functioning, and quality of life? And are these courses, how are they interrelated? Is improvement in one area related to improvements in other areas? We do not know. Third question, and a very important one, which baseline characteristics play a particular role in predicting persistence of or desistance, so ceasing a substance use in life later? And the last one is more an exploration of, let's say, whether the type of treatment a person received in terms of type of treatment, intensity, and duration, if that is a predictor of effectiveness for some groups and not for others. So we look at moderators of effect of the course based on the treatment type also. These were drawings made by a cartoonist. It is in Dutch. Let the youth come to us. So we said, well, it's a naturalistic study, so we want to be as non-restrictive, as lenient as possible when including our youth. We do not want to have highly specific inclusion criteria because we will miss people. And that is not, we want, every youth was welcome. If he or she was aged between 16 and 22 years, I'll come back to that later. If his or her primary substance use for treatment demand was cannabis, alcohol, or stimulants, and if the youngster was willing to participate. And we only had 2 exclusion criteria if a person was referred only for diagnostic evaluation, so not for treatment, because then it would not make sense to see the course after treatment, and if the person could not comprehend our language. And that's all, basically. These are data based on the youth addiction treatment registration, and due to privacy reasons, these data were not available anymore after 2016. So this is the situation that we based our sampling frame on the year 2016. But due to privacy reasons, we were not able to allow, we were not allowed to collect these data anymore. So what you can see is from those that between 11 and 22 years who asked for help at the treatment system, addiction treatment system, nearly 90% was 16 years or older. So we are not able to reach the young people good enough. And that is really a problem. So I'm very curious if you have any comparable situation in Turkey. Maybe we have the opportunity to talk about it. These are the primary substances for which the youth ask help for in the treatment system. And as you can see, while for adults in the Netherlands it's primarily alcohol for more than half of the treatment demand, for the youngsters it is cannabis. More than 50% of the Dutch youngsters ask help for cannabis problems. Alcohol is a good second, with about 17%, and the stimulants, with about 10%, are a good third. So together, the primary substance use disorder in the Netherlands concerns cannabis, alcohol, or stimulants in nearly 80% of the cases. So it has a big coverage, and that was a reason also to include these 3 substances and not many other substances as a primary treatment demand. So if you go back to our inclusion criteria based on age and type of primary substance. We were able to cover 3/4 of all youth that had asked for treatment. So we thought it was a sufficient good coverage of the treatment system. From the 4,000 something youngsters in the Netherlands that met these criteria, we had a 10% sampling frame to come to a sample in the end of 420 youngsters. When you look at the assessments and the domains, we have elaborate interviews at baseline and 2 and 4 years after baseline. They concern, well, basically a whole range of important things that might be important for predicting course. So the course of addiction and other functioning. Of course, social background, substance use and disorders, the treatment history, I will come back to that, the intention of treatment. So we ask, that's often forgotten, but we ask to the youngsters, what is your intention? Do you want to cease your substance use, or do you want to reduce? Or are you sort of sent by your mother or your father and don't you know yet what you want? Or maybe you don't want to stop? So we ask that, and perhaps that itself might be a predictor. It's not necessarily that youngsters are highly motivated to start treatment. It's always ambivalent. They always think about, well, what can we win? What can we lose? What am I doing here? I don't have a problem with drugs. Come on. Yeah. Anyway, we include also a DSM-5 non-submental disorder structured diagnostic interview that we specifically developed for the addiction treatment system. And we ask specifically about symptoms that are not only present due to withdrawal or acute intoxication, to rule out substance use disorders that are directly induced by drugs. So we have a special interview about it. Instruments that are quite well known, the depression, anxiety and stress scale, the prodromal questionnaire PQ-16 is one of the worldwide most used psychotic-like experiences questionnaire. It measures early sort of signs and symptoms of possible psychosis, so hearing voices or strange experiences, etc. And it appears to be a quite robust predictor of high risk first episode, psychotic episode. So we include that also in our assessment battery to see whether it perhaps has a more broader significance for predicting mental health misery. SERPs, substance use risk profile, a well-known list from Patricia Conrad in the addiction field, and it measures traits, impulsivity, novelty seeking, depression, etc. So personality traits. Intellectual disability, family functioning, family history. Also we use a family history method developed by an American named Shuckett, that the youngster makes a sort of good guesstimate about the use of substances by his or her parents and grandmother and grandfather and siblings for which they had to have treatment. So we also have, so sometimes we call it poor genetics. We do not do a genetic scan, would be too difficult also with only a sample of 430, but the youngster has to say something about the risk of his familiar load basically. Social functioning, criminality, etc., quality of life measures. And we also have two sort of a biomarker, hair cortisol for stress, and a psychomarker for neurocognitive tasks. And most of the tasks on the computer are choices between either immediate or delayed rewards, like delay discounting, a very famous task, or between certain and risky options, like gambling tasks. And there are many tasks that we expect to play a role in the prediction of persistence also. Well, the first question we had is, did we obtain a representative sample of our country? Because that was the purpose. And we look at three aspects: the geographical sort of coverage, the coverage of the age groups and the coverage of the substances that we wanted to measure as primary substances. Well, these are 10 of the 13 included treatment organizations, and we see that virtually all had a good inflow of youngsters in the study. The distribution age, according to the sampling frame that you saw in 2016, actually came into the cohort. We see a little bit of underestimation of young people, so the 16 and 17-year-old, which is a pity, because we wanted to have more of them, and correspondingly a little bit oversampling of the 19, 20, and 21 years old. So it's a little skewed sample to the older ages. When we look at the distribution and the sampling frame and what is actually in the cohort, we see quite a good distribution, a little bit more cocaine, primary cocaine use in the cohort, but in absolute numbers still it's quite in the same range. The results, as I said, we have some baseline results that are quite new. We stopped our baseline, I think, last year in August, and we are now over halfway for the 2-year follow-up, and we will start with the 4-year follow-up in a couple of months. What we saw next to, let's say, the demographic background, well, first of all, that nearly a quarter of the group was already treated earlier for addiction. So even at that age, there's all sort of a turning over of multiple treatment requests. We were surprised about that. One thing that surprised us most, and of course we knew about high rates of comorbidity, is that more than half of those that we reach already received treatment earlier for another mental health problem. So this is the population that you also see in adolescent and child psychiatry. And after addiction treatment in our institute or elsewhere, you will see them again in, well, perhaps adolescent and child psychiatry or in adult psychiatry, at least many of them. So there's a much sort of intertwined comorbidity between addiction and other mental health disorders. This is based on the view of the youngster. So according to the youngster, more than a quarter of the fathers and 15% of the mothers had an alcohol problem for which they would have needed treatment. Similar, drug problem, father 16%, mother. Okay, mental health problems also high. About a third of father and mother that were so severe that the youngster said, well, my father or my mother actually would have needed treatment or went into treatment. It's quite a reliable viewpoint. Well, a special thing that I want to go into is the adverse childhood experiences. And from the decades of research, I think even as of the 1960s, it became more and more clear how detrimental certain experiences in early childhood can be. That it can be detrimental for many negative outcomes in life. So we included on our baseline interview a very comprehensive series of possible adverse childhood experiences, not only in terms of whether they were present or not present, but also how frequent it occurred. So if there was like domestic violence, was that never or sometimes or often or perhaps daily? So we have quite a sort of strong, rich database about ACEs. This is not from our study, but from a recent meta-regression analysis conducted by Grummet et al. About the association of childhood adversity with all kinds of diseases and with death, premature death in adults. These were the ACEs that were included in the study, and it's always about threat and deprivation, either one of those, like neglect or threat of abuse, either physical or emotional abuse, physical neglect or emotional neglect, sexual abuse, but also a whole lot of other ACEs. This is a graph I took from this systematic review, and as you can see, is that simply the number of ACE types that the child experienced, in this case from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, or 4 or more, is a good indicator of many bad things in life. So the simple count, again, cumulative risk, is a good indicator of later negative outcomes. In this example, daily tobacco smoking in life, harmful alcohol use, illicit drug use, and suicide. Those with 4 or more types of ACEs, in the general population that is, have a 7 times higher odds on suicide in life compared with those with no ACEs. That's really alarming. What about the ACEs in our study? We looked only at the physical, emotional abuse, physical, emotional neglect, and sexual abuse, so not to the other ones. These are preliminary data. What we saw is that especially the neglect, and many studies find that recently, that especially the neglect types of ACEs are highly prevalent. Also in our population, 58% for emotional abuse and emotional neglect. So emotional parts are sometimes also more detrimental than the physical parts. Sexual abuse, I think, is a strong underestimation because we only asked for sexual abuse by caregivers, so the parent or other caregivers, and not other people. So we will go into more deep into that in our study in the future. Also here, the number of ACEs, if that's such a good predictor of many misery things in life, how does it look like in our study? 1/3 has 0 ACEs and the rest, so 69%, had at least 1 ACE. And also here you can see 1 in every 5 have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So we expect to find in the course of life also many negative outcomes associated with it. Substance use. Of course, the 3 types of primary demand substances are highly prevalent in our sample. More than 60% cannabis, 20% alcohol, 20% stimulants. What you can see when you look at the age of onset of first use, the light blue bars, and the age of onset of regular use of a substance, you see, well, of course, alcohol is often the first substance ever used in somebody's life, in the youth's life, followed by cannabis, and sometimes followed by hard drugs, like amphetamine and cocaine. What you can also see is that the progression from first to regular use, for example for alcohol, is much slower for alcohol and cannabis than for the hard drugs. Cocaine and amphetamines have a much faster progression from first use to regular use in life. Cannabis is used on the average for and it's a primary drug, so this is an underestimation of the true duration before the start of treatment of 3 years. So it takes about 3 years before the youngsters ask help at our treatment, of the current treatment. 2 years for alcohol, and also here a shorter period of regular use for the stimulants. Substance use disorder, according to DSM-5, we were still, even though we're already decades in this profession of addiction and addiction treatment, we were still surprised to see that in terms of severity, based on the criteria of the DSM-5, that more than 90% met the criterion of severe substance use disorder. So maybe you know the criteria, I'll go in depth on that on the next slides. 2 or 3 criteria represent a mild substance use disorder, 4 or 5 moderate, and 6 or more severe. So nearly all of those in treatment have a severe substance use disorder. When you look at the number of criteria, these are the 6 and higher apart, the 93%, but still you see there's quite some variance in it. So we expect that even at the top, among the most severe addicted youth, that there is still prediction power in it. That those who have more severe, meet more criteria, perhaps have a different prognosis also in treatment. Well, these are the 11 criteria. Probably you are familiar with those. They pertain to 4 sort of domains of functioning. Of course, the most important part of addiction disorders is loss of control. I think that's the sort of pivotal, especially longer use than intended, and craving, Those are important criteria. Social limitations due to the use of substances, risky situations in which substance use occurs, and physical dependence, so tolerance and withdrawal. We looked into the percentage of people who endorsed, the young people who endorsed which criterion. And then you see that from the loss of control, the most highly endorsed are those with longer use. That is, of course, a strong sign of loss of control, and craving and strong desire to again use the substance. We were a little bit amazed that tolerance and withdrawal was also highly endorsed, while most of them had cannabis as primary drug. And cannabis is not well known for having strong physical dependence, as opposed to alcohol, for example. Most criteria were endorsed as, in a similar way between those with primary cannabis, alcohol, stimulants, with the exception of the 7th criterion. There you see an average of 53%, but those with stimulants endorsed this criteria much more than those with alcohol and cannabis. And I think that is because the criterion important social activities are given up because of substance use. That is because stimulants are have more acute effects than alcohol and cannabis, and much stronger. So it makes sense why these stimulant youth endorse these criteria more often. Psychiatric comorbidity. Well, first, let me see. Yeah. We started the study in 2018, I think, 2019, yes. And as you know, in 2020, we had the first lockdowns due to COVID. So there was a sort of natural experiment to look into, for our baseline assessment, whether the inclusion that was before the first lockdown, I think it was in April 2020, differed in terms of depression, anxiety and stress on our DAS-21 stress scale, as opposed to those who came in later during lockdown periods. And this is what we saw. No difference whatsoever. We had expected really, dramatic differences, but we did not. And we wonder why that is. I mean, not on the total score, not on any of the subscales. And what we hypothesize is those that enter the addiction treatment, and perhaps also the mental health treatment system, they already are at the sort of ceiling effect. They're already at the top of problems. And it was before COVID the case, but also after. So we hypothesized that would not make a difference. But perhaps you have alternatives for that. These are the results in the Youth in Transition study based on our structured diagnostic interview. And it's really, these are all diagnoses next to addiction, right? So this is comorbid psychiatric disorders. High rates of depression, past year, nearly half. 1/3 have a past year ADHD disorder, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, 1/4, and 1 in every 5 of our youngsters have a conduct disorder. So 2 externalizing and 2 internalizing disorders in the top 4 of the disorders. Panic disorder, anxiety disorders, also very prevalent. 34% meet any of the anxiety disorders, and all in all, only less than 1/4 have a addiction only, so as the only diagnosis without any comorbidity, and more than 1/4 meet the criteria of 3 or more mental disorders in addition to addiction. So these are high comorbidity rates. We further looked into what are the most overlapping disorders. And that is the last part of this presentation. Much overlap between those with depression and anxiety. And many say, well, they're on the same continuum, right? So in those with depression, there's nearly half also have an anxiety disorder, and vice versa. Among those with anxiety, 2/3 have also depression. Similar between depression and PTSD, 52 and 73%. Anxiety disorder and PTSD used to be an anxiety disorder in DSM-4. It's now classified under the stress-related disorders, but it's not surprising that also here very much overlap. And of course also between the externalizing disorders, much overlap, in addition to addiction. So, well, I'm not sure if these are really implications, but there are a take-home message, I think, for all of us. First, psychiatric comorbidity in addiction is not the exception, but it is the rule. I think these are even might be underestimations because we did not look even at the personality disorders. Second, on a routine basis, and it does not happen in our country, I'm very curious about the Turkish situation. On a routine basis, please start with screening for at-risk substance use in all youth that apply for adolescent treatment, older than 12 years in your facility and vice versa for psychiatric comorbidity. That's what we do in our addiction treatment centers. In youth addiction care, I have the feeling in our country, in the Netherlands, that youth addiction care is a little bit more willing to include and look at the comorbid other mental disorders than vice versa. That child and adolescent psychiatry in our country is a little bit afraid of addiction and does not really know what to do with it. Should I send the person back to the addiction facility or should I include it? But what should I do? I don't have much knowledge or experience. Please let me know. Treat substance use disorders and comorbid mental health disorders in conjunction. They are very much related with each other and follow the advice in the guidelines for the disorders in question. That sounds like a sort of redundant, okay, a big deal, so I have to use the guidelines. But what it actually says is that for people who are afraid to treat the comorbid mental disorders, you can use the same guidelines. That's still the top advice, whether it's addiction or not, follow the guideline for depression or for anxiety, etc. So that's a really important conclusion. Stabilization and reduction, and if feasible, abstinence, cessation of substance use is almost always a first good step. And what I see also in my own institute is that sometimes diagnosticians or treatment physicians, they are too strict in what they want, that they sort of really said you have to become abstinent before, etc., etc. Otherwise I cannot do a diagnosis, and then you really run the risk to lose your adolescent, and then you're further away from your goal as ever. So be not too strict in what you should do in the beginning. Treating the comorbid psychiatric disorder, we know that from many meta-analyses, we're also the developers of two guidelines in the Netherlands on alcohol use disorder and other drugs. But treating the comorbid psychiatric disorder usually does not improve the outcome of addiction treatment. Not even the other way around also, but it's always good to stabilize. And for this reason, but that's more I think for our country, maintain the specialism of addiction treatment in your organization. Because it's under pressure also. Our study is work in progress, as I said. We have, at the end of treatment, we are surprised that we were able to have 99% response rate. We could reach nearly everybody. And a 2-year follow-up, as I said, we have a close to 90% follow-up rate. So we're able to reach many of the adolescents 2 years later. So we're very happy about that. And that's about it for this presentation. Thank you.